this one, I guess. This is the Soviet AA20, the worst train ever made, by History of Everything.
Back in the 1930s, the Soviet Union was going through a time of change. Namely, Stalin was gulagging or starving everyone he disagreed with, and then forcing everyone who remained to build enormous projects like this big dam in Ukraine. Stalin's 5-year plan, the Soviet Wonder Plan, was in full swing. And to power it, the Soviets needed to seriously upgrade their logistics networks to match because, well, the USSR, if you haven't noticed, was quite big. Logically, this meant more train tracks, more connections, and better planning. Right? No, this is the Soviet Union. The Soviet solution was to just make train bigger. At about this time in history, the cornerstone of all transportation in the USSR was done by steam trains. And yes, I can hear the excitement from the 5 of you that are train mad in the back. This one's all about steam trains. And to be honest, the mainstay of modern Russia and a lot of former Soviet countries' transportations and logistics these days are also trains. But they're all boring diesels and electrics, and steam trains are cooler, so let's talk about them instead. But what happens when you put the Stalinist Soviet Union in charge of building new, bigger trains, after you've already purged and gotten rid of all the smart people who've made trains before? Well, you get this. The AA20.
I mean, it looks nice. It has a very proud-looking head, I guess. I don't know how to describe it. It's big. ExoticBankai. I mean, yeah, it looks nice from the outside.
Quite possibly the worst and stupidest train ever built.
Let's learn. A20 sounds like a battery, like a big battery type. And you remember, like, I'm sure they still produce, but like, you know, you have like the small one, right? But then for like old lamp type from like the 70s or 80s, you sometimes have like this like very like big round batteries. I wonder if I can find them. Old lamp batteries. Yeah, something like this, but even bigger and like rounder, yeah, like this kind of thing. Yeah, for this kind of lamp, right? I don't know if it like there was a lot in different countries, but when I was young, we used to have this kind of lamp, and they had like this massively big, like, you know, battery pack, I guess.
In the early 1930s, the Soviet Union was pushing hard to industrialize. Rail freight was vital for moving raw materials, coals, ores, and really for general logistics. Heavy, powerful locomotives were in great demand. Meanwhile, globally, there was a trend to build even larger steam locomotives to haul heavier loads. This was particularly obvious in the US, where articulated designs or long non-articulated designs, where track length permitted them, were being pushed. The most famous of these mega trains was undoubtedly the Union Pacific's Big Boy. I love that name, Big Boy. A simple articulated train with a 488 four-wheel arrangement. The Big Boy would make its debut in 1941 with 25 locomotives being built from 41 to 44, operating well into the 60s before being retired and replaced by modern locomotives. Today, 8 of these behemoths are still around, and the Union Pacific still operates one, number 4014 in running order, as the largest and most powerful operational steam locomotive in the world. This mega train shows what can happen when thought and effort are put into building a locomotive, and above all, the benefits of keeping to a tried and true design, namely the 488 four-wheel arrangement. Interestingly, the Yanks actually used a similar arrangement on the more numerous Challenger type of locomotives with a 4664 arrangement. But why am I talking about these two American trains? Well, it's to show you that to build a mega super large over-the-top steam train, you kinda want to get the basics right first, and then evolve the design into a bigger vehicle. Meanwhile, back in the USSR, engineers started to take notice of this success being experienced by the US large trains, taking particular notice of the Union Pacific's 9000 class. This train was a little different, having been built with a unique 412 two-wheel arrangement. But hang on, wheel arrangements, 484s, 412 2s, what is all this? Well, I'm glad you asked, because I had no idea before I started to look in to make this video in myself, and I've been researching it for a while now to bring this to you. See, steam locomotive wheel arrangements describe the layout of leading, driving, and trailing wheels using notation. For example, 462, 4 leading wheels, 6 driving wheels, and 2 trailing wheels. This impacts the engine's stability, traction, and purpose. Different configurations like the Fast Pacific 462 or the Heavy Consolidation 280 were designed to suit specific roles such as passenger or freight service. The reason the big boy is a 4884 is that there are 4 wheels at the front, 4 wheels that lead and guide around the engine around corners, then 2 sets of 4 drive and power wheels, and then a set of 4 at the rear, which trail and offer support and stability for the firebox and driver's cabin. Well, it makes sense, right? Clear as mud? Yep, cool. We'll continue. The Soviet state rail companies sent a group of 30 students, mind you, these are the ones that survived the purge, to the US to get some ideas on new trains. And it was during this trip that they began looking at the 9000 with its 412-2 configuration. The engineers excitedly took all of about 5 seconds and thought to themselves, well, why don't we just make bigger? Is this train big? Why don't we make bigger? Because we Soviet, we make bigger. And so the 414-4 configured AA20 was born. And oh good God above, should it have been aborted at conception.
Bigger doesn't always mean bigger. No, bigger doesn't always mean better, right? That's the classic. I mean, same thing with building, right? You know, there was a limit eventually for skyscrapers because at some point, you know, you just can't ensure the stability and all that. And it's the same with many other things, yeah? Yeah. I mean, you know, usually it's the US doing it, right? Like with cars, for example, there's always like bigger cars where you can't see anything and, you know, you can run over people like so easily, stuff like that. I don't know. I understand, like, on paper the idea, right? If I had something bigger, you know, it can do more stuff, but it's often like a trap.
Okay, so for this next bit, we're going to go through the stats of the train. This will be incredibly mind-numbing for those of you who aren't a train fan, and incredibly stimming for those of you who are, so feel free to skip ahead for a few seconds. I'll put the timestamp on screen to when we're done with the explanation, but...
Oh wow, it's super long. Yeah, you know what? I guess we don't need the technical jargon because I don't know what I will say to technical jargon. Where was the timestamp? 1355. I guess we can go straight to why it's so bad or something.
To me either.
Okay, now that you're all asleep or absolutely stimming from his little show and tell, and from the steam train, really depends on the person, let's get back to the narrative. Soviet government officials, likely blowing a hole in their pants from excitement at the prospect of the gigantic train, approved the design and work began in 1934. The project was so big though that the USSR needed help from abroad, so it involved cooperation with the parts and initial work being undertaken by Krupp in Essen, at the time in Pinwheel Cartoonville in Germany. These parts were then upon completion shipped over to the Voloshilovgrad locomotive factory in what is now modern-day Luhansk in Ukraine. Some further design features and special modifications were incorporated in attempts to mitigate the difficulties of such a large rigid wheelbase, these including addressing the fixed driving axle configuration, which caused significant issues negotiating curves. To help, the middle 3 driving axles were made flangeless, so that those wheels wouldn't bind or cause too much lateral force on the curves. Remember when my train nerd friend described the wheels that actually have power to them? Yeah, they're the wheels that have power to them. They took their ability to actually stay on the track off.
Okay.
Go Soviet Union. The front and rear driving axles were provided with lateral motion devices to improve curving ability, but like he said in the video, didn't do much. The leading bogie pilot and trailing arrangement were also designed to help with stability. Didn't do much. Once it was finished, the train rolled out onto the tracks,
so
and you're about to see why
much.
this was only undertaken once and why one unit was only ever completed. A second was planned but never finished, and we're about to find out exactly why.
It would be funny if he just starts and crash in the first 5 minutes.
AA20 was sometimes given the name A. Andreev in honor of Andrei Andreev, a hardline Stalinist, and so eloquently put by Simon Montefiore when the purges came around. This Andreev became the unchallengeable master of these murderous sideshows. Some highlights include this absolute creature of a human being, because remember, he is human even though he's barely able to get that title, would randomly travel around the Soviet Union, find a local party leader, accuse them of being a traitor, or he'd rock up into a town, say that they'd arrested the wrong people, and then order everyone to arrest other random...
That's what I've learned though, like, you know, the Stalin purge was so extreme that, you know, just actually being loyal to him wasn't enough, right? Like, if you just stood around doing nothing, you would just get accused of something, because yeah, that's the strategy, right? Like, the only way to survive is to, you know, prove your loyalty not by being loyal, but by denouncing people whether they were actually disloyal or something doesn't matter, right? You just seem loyal to him, you should denounce other people, I guess. So like, yeah, I'm not surprised some people were doing it to anybody they could find.
People. And he would then himself organize mass executions. Seriously, look this guy up, he's just the worst. Fitting that this absolute hunk of crap was named after him. Kind of suits the personality. Now, it must be said, on paper, this train looked amazing, and in person its sheer size must have been awe-inspiring. It was thought that the huge boiler with a massive firebox would be needed because the coal quality was so low. Yes, the Soviets were planning for their coal to be crap. And the logic was that this train would then need to burn more coal than its contemporaries in order to power the
cost on everything,
dragging behind it the wealth of the USSR. But in reality, it had serious flaws in practice, and I mean serious flaws as a number of trials carried out would prove. Let's go through some of the issues. Starting with curves, track, and wheelbase. The rigid frame with 7 coupled axles resulted in a very long fixed wheelbase. Even with flangeless middle axes and lateral motions in the outer driving axles, the AA20 was often unable to stay properly on tracks in curves. It frequently derailed in extremely stupid ways by just popping off the tracks or falling through them because it was so heavy, and this was especially common at switches where the track would bend or just be completely squished by the locomotive. That brings us to point number 2. The train itself was so heavy and so long that besides its constant derailing problems, it put excessive lateral push forces on the rails, especially when it came to curves. This weight and torque physically pushed the tracks apart, performing that, plopping in the middle of the tracks issue I just mentioned. It would permanently damage the tracks, the rails themselves, the sleepers, and components of the track infrastructure like points. The high forces in curves made track maintenance basically impossible, and if the AA20 ran on a track, any following train would be told basically, lol, good luck. Remember how I said at the start the solution?
So again, it's like no one did the calculation in advance, right? Like, how much bigger can we make a train to still work with the current track system, I guess? They just didn't make this calculation. They just only calculated how to make a big train, and then they realized actually it doesn't fit. Shit. Well, whatever, I guess.
To the Soviet freight problem was more tracks and infrastructure. Well, this is where Yuri's idea of building a bigger train was extremely flawed. The AA20 was too large for many of the existing facilities. Turntables, engine sheds, and any other service structures that were often too small to accommodate its length, limiting where it could go and who could maintain it, and, defeating its purpose in the first place. Oh, you thought we were done? Oh no, we're not close yet. While its tractive effort was high for Soviet trains, this also put strain on couplers. The couplings used on rolling stock sometimes were not strong enough to cope with the forces the AA20 could exert, and carriages would just pop off. The design required high steam generation, but like we've been saying, the coal quality and water quality and feeding capacity limited the ability to sustain maximum power. The locomotive reportedly had poor steaming, in some trials with the rate of steam generation.
That's right, yeah. I had read that. I mean, it's not really that they had difficulty, it's basically like when they invaded Russia, the German train size and, the tracks and all that was different than the Soviet one. So yeah, obviously, they couldn't just feed their own stuff, which was a big problem of the invasion, right? Same thing with the fuel, I think. Like Soviet fuel was different, and, it would mess up the tanks and the vehicles, so they had to bring their own one. Stuff like that, yeah. But, I feel like that was more like, a lucky thing than a smart thing.
Performance and other boiler dynamics barely able to keep up the demands, meaning that this giant would lumber along slowly, inhaling insane amounts of coal for little reward. Think about driving your car in second gear with the limiter screaming at you the entire time, or trying to get an asthmatic to run a marathon by pulling a go-kart with no food for 3 days. By comparison, the big boy had 10 times the boiler pressure, double the pulling power at double the speed, compared to the coal it ran on oil and had an automatic mechanized stoker. Yeah, the big boy was just better in every way. And that brings us to the rub. With all these limitations, it could never enter regular service. So despite its enormous size and its engineering efforts to adapt, the AA20 was essentially practical for regular use. The train was very much like the latest Soviet Konkordsky. It looked really impressive, but in reality, it was a gigantic white elephant. But that raises the question, what could the Soviets do with it after trials? Oh, come on, I don't need to ask this question. The answer is propaganda, of course.
Just saying we built the biggest thing, that's it. I mean, I guess there was a lot of Soviet project like that. Recently I saw a photo on Reddit on some crazy like military airplane that is abandoned from Soviet era, right? And it was this weird ass design, and it's massive, and it was never like very usable, right? But it was built, it was made, right? I think that's what's amazing about like Soviet Union design is that, you know, it wasn't just some crazy design on paper that people would say, this is stupid. They would actually make it and then realize it's stupid. So there's a lot of things that were made that are just like so insane and in a way kind of cool for being insane.
Now, normally this would be where we end the video laughing, but let's stop and ask ourselves why this mega train failed, because it is interesting. The AA20 is on paper not the worst idea. Bigger train to pull bigger freight in what would be a bigger economy. And most countries did make bigger trains for bigger loads, like the Big Boy in the US or the Garrett in the Commonwealth. But the Soviets just really weren't thinking here, and they couldn't get past the propaganda value of having the world's biggest train. One of the biggest failures of the AA20 was its framing, which brings us to...
At the same time, I don't think I can really blame the creators, right? The Purge got rid of all the experienced scientists and stuff like that, so as you said, it was like students that came up with this, which is like, you know, can you really blame them for like fucking it up? They were students, and they asked to do something never done before, like the biggest train. I think it's fair, you know, like, yeah, maybe you could say this came out better than, you know, even expected, considering like what to make it.
To the rigid frame and lack of flexibility, literally. Non-articulated frames are simpler in many respects, but when you scale up the number of coupling axles, your fixed wheelbase becomes huge. Curves and switches demand some flexibility through lateral motion and cornering ability. The AA20 tried to mitigate this with those improvements, I'm using improvements in air quotes here in Luhansk that I mentioned before, but they weren't enough to overcome the effects of a very long rigid driver set, or weren't very well thought out, if at all. Similarly, the design of a really big boiler in theory can deliver a lot of steam and power, but in practice fuel quality, water quality and steaming rate and daily operating demands make a huge difference. If coal is less than ideal or feed water is inadequate, you'll get poorer performance and need more maintenance. These kind of supporting systems are often the unseen limit when it comes to these megatrains, and unlike in the US, there were significant track infrastructure constraints for trains of this size. The existing Soviet track in many places was simply not engineered for large locomotives. The curves were too tight, switches were not designed for the force, turntables too small, rails and sleepers not strong enough for the stresses, etc. To deploy a locomotive like the AA20, it would require upgrading the track, loading gauges, turntables, which defeats the point of making it in the first place to avoid having to invest in massive track upgrades. Up until 1939, the Trans-Siberian Railway, for example, was only a single track. It's part of the reason why you have so many instances during the Soviets-Russian Civil War where you've got trains full of Czechs coming into stations with prisoners of war full of Hungarians, and they proceed to start having brawls with each other because they're stuck together and they've been enemies for years, forced to live together. It just doesn't end well. So that leaves you with the only other choice, which is more modifications on the train. More moving parts means larger structures, heavier components means more wear, more maintenance, more opportunity for failure. In some parts, like couplers, track joints and switches, are being stressed beyond typical design usage, their failure rates rise. The AA20's frequent track damage and derailing would only increase the maintenance demands, rather than help fix the problem. Even if the locomotive in principle could haul larger loads or reduce the number of engines needed, the cost of upgrading the infrastructure and higher maintenance, lower availability and frequent failures would make the train simply not worth it. Which begs the question, how in the hell did the Soviets manage to produce both arguably the worst ever train on the planet, but also one of the best steam engines ever made? Well, two of the best steam engines ever made, come to think of it, at the exact same time.
Different people working on different things. I mean, again, the Soviets also probably did a bunch of good things, right? Like in all the madness of this kind of project, I'm sure there were some projects that were good. I mean, for example, like, I think they were not bad with planes, for example. and maybe other things that I cannot think of. Maybe tractors, right? Also, I mean, maybe not quite at this point, but later on cars, right? I mean, some of their cars were like insane in terms of like longevity, just very robust. So yeah, not everything is good, but some of it.
Felix, that and IS, Joseph Stalin series steam locomotives, in stark contrast to the monster that was the AA20, represent two of the most successful and iconic examples of heavy steam power in the USSR's rail history. They also produce what is, in my opinion, one of the coolest looking trains ever made. Yes, I know the Mallard is very cool and the Flying Scotsman, they take the cake, but look at this, it's so nice! The FD series was introduced in the early 1930s, and it was a 210-2 heavy freight locomotive designed to haul long and heavy freight trains across the vast expanses of the USSR. This train really became a workhorse for the USSR, and over 3,000 of them were built. A little later, in the mid-1930s, the IS series entered the picture as a 284 passenger locomotive, intended for long-distance passenger services. Both of these locomotives marked a major leap forward in Soviet train technology and manufacturing capability. The FD in particular became the backbone of the Soviet freight operations for decades. It's also the backbone of the Soviet zombie post-apocalyptic train network, which is a whole thing that I could make a video about in itself.
And I mean, I guess this is how it is in engineering and invention, right? I mean, I'm sure like most countries at their moment of building something stupid alongside a bunch of good ideas, I guess, I assume it's not that uncommon, right?
The FD design was rugged, reliable, and relatively easy to maintain. It couldn't pull the biggest loads, sure, but for the state of the Soviet rail network, it was the perfect compromise between freight load sizes and speed, meaning that this train excelled in Soviet conditions. This rings especially true given the often undeveloped and widely spaced infrastructure of the USSR at the time and into the following years. The IS, or Joseph Stalin series, meanwhile, while built in smaller numbers at around 700 units, was a complete prestige project, and it became the flagship of Soviet express trains before and after World War II. These locomotives were faster than the FD, and were praised for their smooth running and superior speed capabilities, reaching speeds of up to 120 kilometers an hour. Their design also included more advanced features like roller bearings and better streamlining, making them suitable for the prestigious services like the Red Arrow Express between Moscow and Leningrad. They're also my second favourite train of all time, if you can't tell. I really like the IS series of trains. In comparison, the horror show that was the AA20 was nothing more than a monstrous attempt at leapfrogging and running.
And I don't want to be a basic bitch by saying like Shinkansen or something. I'm sure there's some cooler looking train, yeah. Do I know any? The Polar Express from the movie The Polar Express.
Before they could walk. Designed in 1934 at the same time as these two amazing trains were entering service, the AA20 represents the very worst parts of the Soviet Union, the things that destroyed its navy and turned it into a punchline of so many of my jokes. From an engineering perspective, the FD and the ISs were conservative yet effective. They were scaled-up versions of proven American and European locomotive designs adapted for Soviet conditions. Yeah, that's the craziest part. Remember those scientists and train engineers that the USSR sent to the US that designed the psychotic AA20? They built the FD and IS too. Well, not the IS.
Again, maybe they learned something from building something that doesn't work, and it's thanks to that they made something good. I mean, seems like a classic story, like, I guess not everybody is a genius right away. You have to fail before, getting good.
Dude, that's different. The IS as well. Yeah, we'll go with that. The FD's 210-2 configuration was modeled partly after the American Santa Fe type locomotive, and it was chosen for its excellent balance of tractive effort and weight distribution. Its ability to negotiate curves better than the AA20, combined with its better maneuverability, made it a far more practical solution to the USSR's freight hauling needs. Similarly, the IS Series 284 wheel arrangement offered high speed and stability, ideal for fast passenger runs. Both designs reflected of practical philosophy: build fewer types of locomotives in large numbers, focus on ruggedness over innovation. In contrast, the AA20 represented a more experimental and almost ideological engineering approach, the one that attempted to showcase Soviet technological superiority through sheer scale rather than operational success. aka the AA20 is Wunderwaffe, the IS and the FD are actually good.
Fair enough.
In terms of historical significance, the FD and the IS classes were instrumental in both the economic and military logistics of the USSR during the Second World War and the post-war reconstruction period. The FD particularly hauled countless tons of military supplies, troops, and industrial equipment across thousands of kilometers under extreme conditions. The IS series, while less numerous, symbolized the prestige and modernization of the Soviet rail system and remained in use well into the 50s and 60s, even as diesel and electric traction began to take over. The AA20, by contrast, has become a complete meme, and it died in obscurity. For those wondering, there are plenty of FD series in storage across the Soviet Union, partially as doomsday trains, which again I can get into in another video if the topic is interesting to people, but also in museums all across former Soviet states. There is sadly just one IS train left in existence, and it's on a plinth in Kyiv.
Really?
I do wish there was more, particularly in the colour blue, because as you can see here in Workers and Resources Soviet Republic, the blue IS is absolutely stunning. The biggest reason above all why the AA20 failed and the Union Pacific 9000 didn't really just came down to the constraints of other countries that they were built in. The UP9000s were built within the constraints of the American infrastructure system, a country with wider curves on some lines, heavier rails as well. They also benefited immensely from maintenance and repair facilities which were less sparsely spread out than they were in the USSR. It's the same reason that the FD became one of the workhorse heavy freight locomotives classes in the USSR, because it was more successful and more practical than the AA20 and it fit the Soviet network. The existence of the FD class and its improving subsequent classes meant that once those proved viable, the need for something as radical as the AA20 was less pressing. Articulated locomotives elsewhere, many railways opted for articulated designs, for example the Mallet and the Garrett, allow large boilers and driving wheels, but with the ability to handle curves more flexibly. The AA20's rigid frame was always going to struggle more than these other trains. After its trials in the mid-1930s, the only AA20 to ever exist was never adopted into regular service. It sat idle or was held in storage at shipping test facility for many years, where it remained essentially an oddity, sitting, rusting away before it was scrapped in 1960. Some say that it was used for test in the 30s and the early 40s, but for all intents and purposes, I couldn't find any proof that could actually back those claims up.
Could have been cool if they kept it as a museum kind of thing, but
So for all we know, it just sat there and rusted for years and years and years. But that's it. That's the story of the AA20 Super Mega Awesome's Uber train
what
from
a
the
story.
USSR. The train that was so big that it broke the tracks it ran on. This one particularly interests me because on the surface, the train suffers the same problems as the Navy. But unlike the Navy, this train would be developed aside two incredibly successful designs, the FD and the IS, by the exact same people, proving that maybe, just maybe, common sense is the better option when it comes to infrastructure, and that politicians should bugger off when it comes to designing things. If you'd like to support the channel, please hit the
lesson
link
can
to
be
Patreon.
learned. I guess that's, I feel like, again, they learned the lesson where, by messing up with this one, and, they were much more smart with the later design. Maybe that's what it is. Maybe that's what it is, yeah. Okay, interesting video, maybe a bit too technical at time, and we skipped the technical parts, so yeah, maybe a bit too technical, but still pretty interesting. I kind of like history videos about really weird and unique design engineering project and stuff like that didn't really work out, but were just so weird and special that yeah, they were kind of crazy. I like this kind of stuff. So rest in peace, big train. You were too big for this world, and that's sad. Okay.